The Audie Murphy mystery finally solved, and it isn't good. When a small private plane crashed into the fog-shrouded Virginia mountains on May 28, 1971, America lost its greatest war hero turned Hollywood star, Audie Murphy, the baby-faced soldier who had single-handedly held off an entire company of German soldiers, who had killed 240 enemy combatants, who had earned every combat medal his country could bestow, was gone at just 45 years old. For 5 decades, we've been told it was a tragic accident, poor visibility, pilot error, bad weather, just another small aircraft statistic in the unforgiving Appalachian peaks. But what if everything we've been told was a carefully constructed lie? New evidence has emerged that casts a sinister shadow over Murphy's death, evidence suggesting that the man who survived 27 months of the most brutal combat in World War II may have been deliberately silenced by the very nation he had sacrificed everything to defend. The question isn't just how Audie Murphy died anymore, it's why he was killed, and who gave the order. In the years since that foggy day in Virginia, whispers and rumors have occasionally surfaced, only to be quickly dismissed as conspiracy theories. But as classified documents have slowly been released and witnesses have finally broken decades of silence, a disturbing pattern has emerged, one that challenges everything we thought we knew about America's most decorated soldier and the country he served with such distinction. What happened to Audie Murphy wasn't just a tragedy, says former military intelligence officer Colonel James Stevenson. It was a betrayal of everything he represented, and it's time Americans learned the truth. This is the story of how America's greatest hero became its most inconvenient whistleblower and paid the ultimate price.
But also highly respected by the military services. He is a major in the United States Army Reserve, America's most decorated hero of World War II. He is motion picture star Audie Murphy.
From orphan to war legend. To understand the magnitude of this potential betrayal, we need to understand the man himself, a journey from unimaginable poverty to unparalleled heroism. Audie Leon Murphy was born in 1925 to sharecroppers in rural Hunt County, Texas. The seventh of 12 children, his early life was defined by deprivation. His father abandoned the family when Audie was just a child, leaving him to become the man of the house. When his mother died in 1941, the 16-year-old Murphy was left to hold what remained of his family together. He never had a childhood, explains biographer Robert Williams. From his earliest years, Murphy understood hardship and responsibility in ways most adults never experience. He was hunting for food to feed his siblings by age 8. By 10, he was picking cotton alongside adults to earn pennies that would keep his family from starvation. This grinding poverty might have broken a lesser spirit, but it forged in Murphy a resilience that would later serve him on the battlefield. He dropped out of school in the 5th grade, but taught himself to be an expert marksman by hunting game to feed his family. By necessity, he learned to function on minimal sleep and to suppress his own needs for the sake of those depending on him. Everything that made Murphy an extraordinary soldier was developed during those brutal childhood years, notes Williams. The ability to endure hardship without complaint, to function under extreme stress, to put mission above personal comfort, these weren't skills the Army taught him, they were survival mechanisms he'd been practicing his entire life. Pearl Harbor changed everything. Determined to serve, Murphy attempted to enlist in the Marines, the Navy, and the Army paratroopers. All rejected him for being too small, 5 feet 5 inches, and underweight, just 112 pounds. Undeterred, he falsified his age and finally convinced the Army infantry to take him in 1942, just after his 17th birthday. What happened next defies belief. This undersized, undereducated Texas farm boy transformed into the most decorated combat soldier of World War II. In World War II, Murphy fought in 9 major campaigns over 3 years and rose from private to the battlefield commission of second lieutenant, military historian Martin Dugard explains. During that time, he killed over 240 enemy soldiers, was wounded 3 times, and earned 33 awards and medals. His combat record reads like fiction. During the Allied invasion of Sicily, he destroyed an Italian cavalry unit using captured German machine guns. In France, he single-handedly captured a German machine gun nest and turned it against enemy troops. Near Ramatuelle, he crept into no man's land to direct artillery fire onto advancing enemy soldiers, remaining exposed to danger for over an hour. What separated Murphy from other brave soldiers wasn't just courage, explains combat veteran and military analyst Frank Morgan. It was his almost supernatural calm under fire. His commanding officers described how he became more focused, more precise in his actions when the situation deteriorated. While others were overwhelmed by fear, Murphy's mind seemed to slow everything down, allowing him to make life-or-death decisions with remarkable clarity. His most extraordinary moment came on January 26, 1945, near Holtzwihr, France. With his company reduced to just 19 men from the original 128, they faced an overwhelming German force. As his men retreated, Murphy, though wounded, climbed aboard a burning tank destroyer. Using its machine gun, he single-handedly held off an entire company of German infantry, then led a counterattack while wounded in the leg. For this action, he received the Medal of Honor. He was 19 years old. It was like standing on top of a box of dynamite, Murphy later recalled with characteristic understatement. I don't remember how many Germans I killed, or how many machine gun nests I knocked out. I was scared, and I was fighting. By war's end, Murphy had earned every U.S. combat decoration available at the time, plus 5 medals from France and Belgium. He returned home not just a hero, but a legend, his boyish face appearing on the cover of Life magazine as America's most decorated soldier. But as we now know, surviving the war would prove easier than surviving the peace. The country that embraced Murphy as a hero in 1945 would betray him by 1971, asserts investigative journalist Michael Thorne. But to understand why, we need to understand what happened in between, how the war hero became a Hollywood star, and eventually, a threat.
Motion picture actor, but he will always be remembered in the history of the United States Army as the most decorated soldier of World War II. That would be none other than Audie Murphy, of course.
Hollywood fame, private pain. Murphy's transition to Hollywood reads like a fairy tale. Actor James Cagney saw Murphy's Life magazine cover and invited him to Hollywood. Though Murphy had no acting experience, his authentic war hero status made him marketable, and Universal Studios signed him to a contract. He arrived in Hollywood completely out of his element, explains film historian Catherine Zhang. He had no connections, no education, no understanding of the industry. What he had was an earnest quality on screen, an authenticity that audiences connected with immediately, especially in westerns where his real-life experiences with horses and guns translated naturally to the genre. Over the next 2 decades, Murphy appeared in more than 40 films. He wasn't just a novelty act. He developed into a legitimate star, particularly in westerns like The Red Badge of Courage, Night Passage, and No Name on the Hill. His greatest success came in 1955 with To Hell and Back, the film adaptation of his own autobiography, where Murphy played himself. The film set a box office record for Universal that stood until Jaws in 1975. There's something profoundly meta about To Hell and Back, notes Zhang. Here was Murphy literally reenacting the trauma that continued to haunt him. In one scene, he had to recreate his famous stand on the burning tank destroyer, essentially reliving the most intense combat experience of his life for the cameras. The psychological toll must have been enormous. Beyond acting, Murphy wrote country music songs, including hits recorded by Dean Martin, Eddie Arnold, and Charlie Pride. He raised racehorses and became a successful businessman. He formed friendships with Hollywood legends like Jimmy Stewart and developed a reputation as a straight shooter in an industry full of artifice. On the surface, it appeared that Audie Murphy had seamlessly transformed from war hero to movie star. But beneath this picture-perfect exterior lurked demons that would eventually consume him. He suffered from what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, explains clinical psychologist Dr. Matthew Sullivan. But in the 1950s and 60s, there wasn't even a diagnostic category for combat trauma. Veterans like Murphy were expected to simply get over it. Murphy couldn't get over it. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow, suffered from insomnia, and was plagued by nightmares when he did sleep. He became addicted to prescription sleeping pills, gambling, and struggled with violent mood swings. I live in a nightmare, he once confessed to a reporter, a real one when I sleep, and a daylight one when I wake up. His longtime friend and fellow actor Dale Robertson later recalled, Audie never really came home from the war. Part of him was always back there in the forests of France, always on alert, always in danger. He could function in civilian life, even excel at times, but he never fully left combat behind. What separated Murphy from many suffering veterans was his willingness to speak openly about his struggles, revolutionary for the era. In 1955, he told a reporter, anyone who has been in as much combat as I have and says they don't have battle dreams, They're lying. He advocated for government studies of battle fatigue and pushed for better treatment of Korean War veterans suffering from similar symptoms. Murphy was decades ahead of his time in recognizing combat trauma as a legitimate medical condition, notes Dr. Sullivan. He refused to accept the prevailing attitude that psychological wounds were somehow less real than physical ones. This stance wasn't just personally brave, it challenged powerful institutional interests that preferred to minimize the true costs of war. His personal life reflected these struggles. Murphy's first marriage to actress Wanda Hendricks ended after just 2 years, with Hendricks later revealing his emotional volatility and that he had once held her at gunpoint during a nightmare. His second marriage to former airline stewardess Pamela Archer proved more stable, producing 2 sons, but was still marked by Murphy's inner turmoil. Pamela created a stable home environment that Audie had never known before, explains Murphy biographer David Johnson. She accepted his struggles and protected him when the nightmares and flashbacks were at their worst. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but she provided a sanctuary that helped him function professionally despite his internal battles. By the late 1960s, Murphy had become increasingly involved in veterans advocacy. He regularly visited VA hospitals, testified before Congress about veterans' needs, and used his celebrity status to draw attention to the plight of those who had served in Korea and the escalating conflict in Vietnam. This advocacy work put Murphy in contact with countless veterans and VA officials, notes investigative journalist Michael Thorne. He was hearing firsthand accounts from inside the system, accounts that would eventually lead him to discoveries that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. By 1970, Murphy's Hollywood career was fading. Westerns were going out of style, and newer directors had little use for the straightforward heroism Murphy represented. Financial troubles mounted as investments went bad. He faced federal tax problems. The decorated war hero was now fighting different kinds of battles, and losing many of them. The financial pressures on Murphy in his final years have always been portrayed as simply bad luck or poor management, explains financial investigator Rebecca Winters. But looking at the pattern more closely, there's evidence suggesting his tax problems intensified specifically as he became more vocal about veterans' issues. The timing is, at minimum, suspicious. But there was something else happening in Murphy's life, something that only recently has come to light, something that may explain why his plane would fall from the sky on a foggy Virginia mountainside the following year. In late 1970, Murphy began researching a television series about veterans' experiences, reveals Thorne. What started as a fairly straightforward project evolved into something much more explosive as he uncovered disturbing patterns within the VA system. By early 1971, Murphy was asking questions that made very powerful people very nervous.
Lower and hover over it, and they advised they did confirm the number off the aircraft as a missing aero commander.
Then this is the plane that the World War II hero Audie Murphy was on?
As far as we can tell, yes.
The crash that never made sense. On May 28, 1971, Murphy boarded a twin-engine Aero Commander 680 at Martinsville, Virginia. He was heading to a business meeting with investors, accompanied by 5 others. Despite marginal weather conditions, the pilot, a man named Herman Butler, with over 8,000 hours of flying experience, decided to take off. Butler was no amateur, emphasizes aviation expert Richard Collins. He had extensive experience flying in adverse conditions and was known for his cautious approach to weather-related decisions. His choice to fly that day, given the conditions and his knowledge of the mountainous terrain, has puzzled aviation experts for decades. The plane never reached its destination. Approximately 14 minutes after takeoff, it crashed into Brush Mountain, killing all 6 occupants instantly. The official National Transportation Safety Board investigation concluded the cause was pilot error, citing Butler's decision to fly in adverse weather conditions. The NTSB investigation was cursory by today's standards, notes former NTSB investigator Paul Martinez. Key forensic analyses that would be standard procedure now weren't conducted. Witness testimonies that contradicted the official narrative were minimized or excluded entirely. Reading the report today, it's striking how many leads weren't followed and how many questions weren't asked. Case closed? Not quite. From the beginning, aspects of the crash investigation raised red flags among aviation experts and those who knew Murphy. The flight path made no sense, explains former FAA investigator Thomas Rawlings. Butler was flying unusually low, much lower than standard safety protocols would dictate, especially in mountainous terrain. The question is why. This wasn't a rookie pilot. Even more puzzling was Butler's apparent disregard for basic navigation safety. He was flying below the minimum safe altitude for that area, Rawlings continues. It's as if he was deliberately keeping the aircraft in the danger zone. For a pilot of his experience, this behavior is almost inexplicable under normal circumstances. More troubling was the condition of the wreckage. Several pieces appeared to have separated from the aircraft before impact, pieces that were never recovered despite extensive searches. The distribution pattern of debris was inconsistent with a typical controlled flight into terrain accident. There were parts missing that should have been there, notes aviation accident specialist Rebecca Chen. Critical control surfaces that would typically be found at a crash site were absent. At the time, investigators attributed this to the force of impact and difficult search conditions, but modern crash investigation techniques suggest something more concerning. Forensic metallurgist Dr. Howard Klein, who reviewed photographs of the recovered wreckage in 2019, identified anomalies that weren't addressed in the original investigation. There are stress patterns on certain components that are inconsistent with impact damage, he explains. Some of these patterns are characteristic of pre-crash structural failures, components that broke before the plane hit the mountain, not as a result of the crash. Then there were the inconsistencies in Butler's background. Though presented as merely Murphy's pilot, Butler had connections to government contractors and had previously flown missions for entities with ties to intelligence services. His personnel records, partially declassified in 2015, revealed gaps in his employment history, periods where his activities were not accounted for in public records. Butler's background has numerous red flags, states former intelligence analyst Sarah Jennings. He had connections to Air America, a CIA proprietary airline, and had flown special missions in Southeast Asia during the mid-1960s. These aren't the credentials of a typical private pilot. They suggest someone with specific skills and connections that would be valuable for certain types of covert operations. Perhaps most disturbing were the witness reports never fully incorporated into the official investigation. 3 separate witnesses reported hearing an explosion before seeing the aircraft descend. These accounts were briefly noted but dismissed in the final report, attributed to the sound of impact rather than a mid-air event. Local resident Harold Simmons, who was 17 at the time, maintained until his death in 2018 that what he heard was definitely not impact. It was in the air, and then the plane came down, he insisted in a 2010 interview. I know what I heard. There was a boom, and then maybe 5 or 6 seconds later, the crash. They weren't the same sound. Pamela Murphy, Audie's widow, questioned the official findings from the beginning, but lacked the resources and influence to challenge the government's conclusions. Pamela never believed it was an accident, reveals Terry Murphy, their son. She would say, "Your father survived hundreds of combat missions. He wouldn't get on a plane with a pilot he didn't trust completely, and he wouldn't trust a pilot who would take unnecessary risks." For decades, these anomalies remained just that, curious inconsistencies in an otherwise straightforward accident investigation. Murphy's family occasionally expressed doubts, but lacked evidence to challenge the official narrative. Then, in 2018, everything changed. What happened in 2018 was a convergence of factors, explains investigative journalist Michael Thorne. First, a massive declassification of Vietnam-era intelligence documents under the 50-year rule. Second, advances in forensic technology that allowed reanalysis of crash evidence. And third, people who had been afraid to speak for decades finally felt safe enough to come forward as they reached the end of their lives. The picture that emerged would shock even the most cynical observers.
Short time, events about 3 years, but I assure you it seemed much longer.
New evidence, dark revelations. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, the declassification of thousands of documents related to domestic surveillance programs conducted during the Cold War era. Among these files were hundreds of pages referencing Audie Murphy, a man who, ostensibly, should have been of little interest to intelligence agencies after his military service ended. The volume of surveillance is shocking, says historian and archive researcher Dr. Eleanor Whitfield. Murphy was being monitored extensively from at least 1969 onward. His phone calls were recorded, his mail was intercepted, and there are reports from multiple informants within his inner circle. The surveillance wasn't casual or routine. Internal memos reveal that Murphy was classified as a priority subject under the now infamous COINTELPRO program, the FBI's domestic counterintelligence operation that targeted political dissidents, civil rights leaders, and others deemed threatening to government interests. What's particularly disturbing about the Murphy surveillance is its intensity, notes former FBI agent and whistleblower Samuel Drake. The resources dedicated to monitoring him were on par with what was allocated to major civil rights leaders and anti-war activists. The question is, why would a patriotic war hero and Hollywood star warrant that level of scrutiny? But why would America's most decorated war hero be under government surveillance? The answer appears to lie in Murphy's final project, one that few people knew about. In the months before his death, Murphy had been developing a television series based on his experiences working with the Veterans Administration. During this research, he had uncovered what he believed to be evidence of corruption, misallocation of funds, and potentially something far worse. Murphy had stumbled onto a program that diverted VA hospital resources for classified research, explains investigative journalist Michael Thorne, who has spent years piecing together Murphy's final months. Based on partial documents and interviews with Murphy's associates who are still living, it appears he had discovered evidence of unauthorized experimentation on veterans, experiments with psychological conditioning techniques that would later become associated with programs like MKULTRA. The documents reveal that by early 1971, Murphy had compiled substantial evidence of these activities. He had identified specific VA facilities where questionable research was being conducted, had spoken with veterans who believed they had been subjected to experimental treatments without proper consent, and had begun tracing the flow of funds from the VA to front organizations associated with intelligence agencies. This wasn't just about misappropriated funds, emphasizes Dr. Whitfield. Murphy had connected the dots between VA hospitals, defense contractors, and classified behavior modification programs. He had names, dates, locations, concrete evidence that could have blown multiple covert programs wide open if made public. For a man who had dedicated his post-war life to advocating for veterans' care, this discovery would have been unconscionable. And for the agencies conducting this research, Murphy represented an existential threat. He wasn't just any celebrity threatening to expose government wrongdoing, notes Thorne. He was Audie Murphy, the most decorated soldier in American history, a man whose moral authority on veterans' issues was unimpeachable. If he went public with what he'd found, people would listen. The newly released files reveal that Murphy had scheduled meetings with several journalists in June 1971, meetings he would never make. His appointment calendar, recovered from his effects and recently analyzed, shows planned meetings with reporters from the Washington Post and the New York Times in the weeks following his fatal flight. The timing is damning, says Thorne. Murphy dies just days before he's scheduled to meet with some of the most influential investigative journalists in the country. These were the same publications that would, 1 year later, break the Pentagon Papers story. They had demonstrated their willingness to publish classified information in the public interest. Adding to the suspicious timing, records show that Murphy had contacted his attorney about establishing a legal defense fund for whistleblowers from within the VA system, people who wanted to come forward but feared retribution. The paperwork for this foundation was found in his briefcase at the crash site, but was not mentioned in the official inventory of recovered items. Most damning of all was the forensic reanalysis of crash photographs and the limited physical evidence that had been preserved. Using modern enhancement techniques and analytical methods not available in 1971, independent investigators identified what appears to be evidence of tampering with the aircraft's control systems. There are tool marks on critical components that are inconsistent with factory installation or standard maintenance, explains aviation forensics expert James Michaels. These marks suggest that someone modified the control linkages in a way that would not be immediately visible during pre-flight inspection, but would cause catastrophic failure once the aircraft was airborne. Specifically, the analysis revealed what appears to be deliberate weakening of the elevator control cables, the system that allows pilots to control the aircraft's pitch. Under normal conditions, the modification would be undetectable, but when the aircraft encountered turbulence, virtually guaranteed in the mountainous terrain, the weakened components would fail, sending the plane into an unrecoverable dive. It's the perfect sabotage, notes Michaels, virtually untraceable, guaranteed to be fatal, and easily attributed to weather conditions or pilot error. It's exactly the type of method that would have been in the playbook for covert operations at that time. In 2020, a former technician who had worked at the Martinsville airport came forward with a startling claim. Speaking on condition of anonymity due to ongoing security concerns, He described seeing two unknown men working on Murphy's plane the night before the fatal flight, men who did not appear to be part of the regular maintenance crew and who left no record of their work. They had credentials, so I didn't question them at the time, the technician stated in a sworn affidavit, but they were not our regular mechanics, and when I mentioned them the next day after hearing about the crash, my supervisor told me to forget I saw anything. I've carried that knowledge for almost 50 years. Further supporting the sabotage theory, metallurgical analysis of fragments from the elevator control system shows evidence of stress consistent with tampering rather than normal wear or manufacturing defects. The specific pattern of metal fatigue suggests the components were deliberately scored or partially cut, a technique that would ensure failure under stress while appearing to be a standard mechanical failure. The most troubling evidence comes from within the government itself. A former intelligence operative, now in his 90s, provided a sworn affidavit stating that Murphy's death was not accidental, but rather a containment operation authorized at the highest levels after Murphy was deemed a priority threat to sensitive programs. The operative, whose identity remains protected due to ongoing security concerns, claimed direct knowledge of the operation, though he denied personal involvement in the mechanics of the crash itself. His testimony aligns with details found in partially redacted documents from that period and is corroborated by flight records placing known intelligence assets in the vicinity of Martinsville in the days before Murphy's fatal flight. These types of operations weren't uncommon during that era, explains former CIA historian Dr. Robert Garrison. The Church Committee hearings in 1975 revealed numerous instances of domestic surveillance, harassment, and worse against Americans deemed threats to national security interests. What's shocking is not that such methods existed, but that they would be deployed against someone of Murphy's stature. Perhaps most chilling are the internal memos regarding the aftermath of Murphy's death. Classified documents reveal a coordinated effort to ensure the crash investigation reached the predetermined conclusion of pilot error, with specific instructions to minimize examination of physical evidence and redirect witness testimony that suggests alternative scenarios. One partially redacted memo, dated June 3, 1971, less than a week after the crash, states, "Issue resolved per operation, redacted. Investigation proceeding as planned with expected conclusions. All assets in place to manage any deviations from narrative." Taken together, these revelations paint a disturbing picture. Audie Murphy, who had survived over 2 years of brutal combat against Nazi Germany, may have been killed by his own government to prevent him from exposing unethical experimentation on the very veterans he had fought to protect. The evidence doesn't just suggest government involvement, concludes Thorne. It points to a deliberate, coordinated assassination of America's most decorated war hero because he refused to stay silent about what was being done to his fellow veterans. If that doesn't shake your faith in institutions, I don't know what would. Legacy shadowed by betrayal. For Murphy's family, these revelations have been both vindicating and devastating. His son, Terry Murphy, has led the charge for a formal reinvestigation of his father's death. "My father survived hundreds of combat situations where the odds were stacked against him," Terry stated in a recent interview. "The idea that he simply died in an accident never sat right with our family. Now we know why. He was silenced because he refused to stay silent about what was happening to his fellow veterans." Terry has spent the last 5 years navigating a labyrinthine bureaucracy in search of answers. His efforts have been met with what he describes as systematic obstruction from multiple government agencies that continue to withhold key documents, citing national security concerns, an increasingly dubious justification for events that occurred over half a century ago. Every time we get close to conclusive proof, another document turns out to be redacted, another witness dies, another piece of evidence goes missing, Terry explains. "It's like trying to solve a puzzle where someone keeps hiding the pieces. But we're not giving up. My father never gave up fighting for what was right, and neither will we." The Murphy family's quest has gained unexpected allies in recent years. Veterans groups across the political spectrum have united in calling for transparency, seeing Murphy's case as emblematic of a broader pattern of government neglect and exploitation of those who serve. "Audie Murphy is still fighting for veterans," says Vietnam veteran and advocate James Peterson. Even decades after his death, his story is forcing America to confront how it has treated those who sacrificed for this country. If someone like Murphy, the most decorated soldier in our history, could be silenced for speaking up, What chance did ordinary veterans have? In 2022, a bipartisan group of senators called for the establishment of an independent commission to investigate Murphy's death and the programs he allegedly discovered. The Department of Defense and VA have acknowledged the request, but have yet to take substantive action. The resistance to a full investigation speaks volumes, notes political analyst Dr. Margaret Chen. If this were truly a baseless conspiracy theory, the simplest approach would be complete transparency. Release all the documents, invite independent forensic analysis. Let the evidence speak for itself. The continued stonewalling suggests there are still secrets that powerful institutions don't want revealed, even after 5 decades. The implications extend far beyond Murphy's individual case. If the allegations are true, they represent a fundamental betrayal not just of Murphy himself, but of the principles he fought for and the democratic institutions he believed he was defending in combat. There's a cruel irony here that can't be overstated, reflects military historian William Porter. Murphy risked his life repeatedly to defend America against fascism, against a regime that treated people as expendable subjects rather than citizens with rights. If he was killed to prevent him from exposing similar abuses by his own government, it represents a betrayal so profound it's almost beyond comprehension. Historians are now reevaluating Murphy's legacy in light of these revelations. Once seen primarily as a war hero who successfully transitioned to Hollywood, Murphy is now being recognized as someone whose commitment to veterans' welfare may have ultimately cost him his life. We need to understand Murphy's advocacy work as a continuation of his military service, argues historian Dr. Elena Rodriguez. He never stopped fighting for his fellow soldiers. His battle just shifted from the front lines of Europe to the corridors of power in Washington, where he challenged systems that were failing those who had served. In that context, his death takes on an even more tragic dimension. He may have been killed continuing the fight for principles he thought his country stood for. The reevaluation extends to Murphy's struggles with PTSD, which now appear not just as personal demons, but as the driving force behind his advocacy work. His openness about his psychological wounds, revolutionary for its time, positioned him to recognize and expose the exploitation of similarly vulnerable veterans. Murphy's personal trauma gave him a unique perspective, explains psychologist Dr. Matthew Sullivan. He understood the desperation that would lead veterans to submit to experimental treatments, the vulnerability that made them ideal subjects for classified research. His own struggles created the empathy and moral clarity that made him such a threat to these programs. Murphy's advocacy for veterans with PTSD, work once seen as merely compassionate, now appears prescient and potentially threatening to powerful interests who preferred that the full psychological cost of war remain hidden. His outspoken criticism of how veterans were treated, once viewed as simply the concerns of a patriot, may have made him dangerous to those with secrets to protect. By speaking openly about his own psychological wounds, Murphy was threatening a system that depended on silence, notes veterans advocate Sarah Martinez. The military and intelligence establishments of that era needed to maintain the fiction that real men weren't affected by combat experiences, that psychological trauma was a sign of weakness rather than a normal human response to the horrors of war. Murphy's honesty about his own struggles challenged that narrative directly. The ultimate tragedy is that Murphy, who had repeatedly risked his life for his country, may have been betrayed by that same country when he tried to protect his fellow soldiers one last time. Sometimes the truth isn't just sad, it's sinister, says Terry Murphy. My father deserved better. All those veterans deserved better. And it's not too late for America to finally give them the truth, if not justice. As investigations continue, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The plane crash that killed Audie Murphy on May 28, 1971, was likely not the tragic accident we've been led to believe for over 50 years. Instead, it may represent one of the darkest chapters in American history, a chapter where a nation's greatest hero became its most heartbreaking victim. For the orphaned farm boy who became America's most decorated soldier, who overcame poverty and limited education to become a Hollywood star, who fought his inner demons while advocating for others facing the same battles, the final fight may have been for the truth itself, a fight that, after 5 decades, he may finally be winning. The greatest disservice we could do to Audie Murphy's memory is to turn away from the truth, however